First off, today marks a significant update, and I'd like to acknowledge and recognize that although we're giving news of closure to 4 families, also recognizing that it's a very traumatic event and that we've reopened for them. So for that, I send my sympathies and condolences. Although these 4 investigations were not ours, we remained relentless in pursuing justice for all Canadians. With the emergence of Investigative Genetic Genealogy in 2018, the Calgary Police Service began exploring IGG as an investigative tool to progress current and historical investigations. Since that time, our investigators have worked tirelessly to apply this tool to local cases, including homicides, sexual assaults, and recently we've started working with the Office of the Chief Medical Examiner to identify unidentified human remains. In 2021, my historical homicide investigators approached me and asked if they could assist the RCMP in investigating some historical homicides of young ladies that were found, Calgary citizens that were found deceased just outside the city limits. It was an easy yes. We can't be held back by city borders or jurisdictions that change over time, and so I was very, very happy to see them work on this and have the success they've had. The 4 homicides that they focused on for this investigation were the homicides of Barbara McLean, Melissa Rohorick, Patricia McQueen, and Eva Dvorak. We worked collaboratively with the RCMP to have suitable samples of the suspect's DNA analyzed for the purposes of IGG. In February of 2023, with the assistance of Convergence Investigative Genetic Genealogy, the CPS historical homicide team was able to develop the investigative hypothesis that Gary Serreri was the likely culprit for these homicides. Collaborating with the RCMP, the National Forensic Laboratory, we facilitated the comparison of collected suspect DNA to that of Gary Serreri and learned that the samples were a match. Our investigators have dedicated countless hours lending their investigative genetic genealogy expertise to the RCMP, and we are very grateful to have played a part in finding answers for these families. We'd also like to thank our partners within the RCMP for their partnership in this investigation and ongoing collaboration in all major crimes, serious crimes investigations. I'm open for questions.
Are you looking to see if Gary has killed other girls in Calgary using the DNA?
So that's a good question. So we are very much alive to the fact that that's a possibility. So we have reviewed our outstanding unsolved homicide files, and at this point we do not have any other investigations that we believe he'd be a suspect in the Calgary jurisdiction.
How many more historical homicides are being investigated at the moment? Using the expertise that you just mentioned.
It's a number that fluctuates. So unfortunately, throughout the history of the Calgary Police Service, we have about 114 unsolved homicide files. And we have our historic homicide team supported by civilian specialists and analysts reviewing the files, and we're always looking at are there viable samples. So I can say from 17 years ago when I was in homicide as the staff sergeant, the science has progressed to the point where we're at the time where we didn't believe we had viable samples, and we do now. And so that's an ongoing process at all times. We retain all our samples, and if there's a belief that they may contain DNA, they're stored appropriately so that we don't there's no degradation of the samples.
Sorry, so you said that at one point there was wasn't valid samples and now there are? Like, what
So-
kind of change?
Science. So the ability to extract usable DNA for analysis has improved exponentially over the last 15, 20 years.
Can you say what the DNA was? Like, was it a hair follicle? Was it blood? Was it?
I can't speak to that specifically.
113 cases unsolved. How many are women?
Sorry?
Those unsolved cases, how many are women?
I'm sorry, I'll have to look it up and I can we'll send you that answer. Okay?
How involved will CPS be? RCMP said they were trying to find out if other offenses were committed while using Calgary. So how involved will CPS be with the next steps?
I think we'll be as engaged as we have been throughout this investigation. So whenever they need our support, we'll help them. And if our investigators find a potential link, we won't hesitate to notify them. Our goal is, no matter where, our goal is to seek the truth and find out what's happened to these people. And so jurisdiction's not going to stand in our way.
What do we know so far about the offender's his actions while he was in Calgary? Because he lived here for quite a number of years.
I refer that more to the RCMP side of the investigation. I can say that we had very limited information with regards to his activity within the city at the time.
Back then, at the time of the crimes, was there the relationship that there is now between the Calgary Police, RCMP, and Edmonton Police? Was that some of the borders on solving the case back then?
No, I don't think, I think I've been here for 35 years, and I can tell you that we've had a strong relationship with the RCMP and all the jurisdictions in Alberta for sure. So jurisdictions never stood in the way during my time. And I think the biggest change is that technology is giving us more tools.
Can you say whether Sweary was, if CPS back then had any awareness that he was even in the Calgary area, or if, he was ever wanted in this area, that kind of thing?
The information I have is very inconspicuous. We weren't aware of him or his potential activity.
None of this alias is same can be said for that.
No.
The investigators approached you to allow them to work with the RCMP in 2001. What was sort of the impetus to make that ask?
I think we had started to have some really good success with our investigative genetic genealogy on some Calgary-based files. And I can tell you that the two detectives in the historic homicide file are probably two of the most motivated and driven police officers that we have in the service. And they couldn't accept the fact that they might have skills or knowledge that would help solve these files and not do something for it. So they're very persuasive, but it was very easy, yes.
When did you notify the families of the victims of this new evidence?
The RCMP, so we turned the information over and supported in that way, but the RCMP took care of that side.
To what extent the CPS involved in this investigation? Because you said that through technology, the investigators kind of singled out Gary as the suspect, but at the time, Gary wasn't. You said he was inconspicuous. So, what was the involvement of the CPS in this investigation?
Our investigators worked with their RCMP counterparts, peers, and identified that there was DNA samples from the crime scenes, and then they worked together to get them to a lab, extract usable DNA STRs, and then we loaded them up into GEDmatch, which is a database that allows access, and we were able to work backwards, and that's where we engage our genetic genealogists. So some of the files we do have it's all voluntary, so you have to opt in. So we have very limited scope as far as the amount of DNA that's available through all the different databases. It's a very, very small fraction of people that voluntarily submit it into that system. So there's a lot of work to it. So for a file like this one, the genealogist will build out a family tree, and it'll be 40 feet long, the pages. And what we found is the investigators, they have a very big role. So once we turn over the genealogists, we identify that there's breaks, because not everyone uploads their DNA into any of the databases. So what we do is we call it targeted testing. And so you would have heard Superintendent Hall mention that in Edmonton. And so what that is when there's a break in the family tree, the genealogist will say, if you can contact these people, they'll start to fill in it. So I believe for this investigation, the detectives contacted a number of people. 80 people voluntarily submitted their DNA to be used to create this tree. So it's, again, big hats off to the detectives. So they, their average is between 85 and 95% success. And they're very, very clear that it's completely voluntary. I really want to stress, we are extremely conscious of ensuring the privacy of Canadians, and it's a very voluntary process.
Just to clarify, when they extracted the DNA, Gary's DNA was present in the database, or how did they actually, single out Gary?
So we submitted it into GEDmatch, and then received it, and then our genealogists start doing what they do. And they went back a number of generations and just started building the family tree, doing traditional genealogy work. And then as they started to make their way to more current times, we had gaps. So they're incredible people. So not only do they have a strong scientific background, but they're very, very tenacious investigators themselves. So they'll go use public records, marriage certificates, death certificates, birth certificates to try and fill in this tree and work their way that way.
Through this case, what have you learned, through this case, lessons learned for future investigations?
I think, well, the easy lesson for all the police officers in Alberta is we can do great things when we work together. Another equally important lesson is the value of technology, being very cautious with it, and working with our prosecutors. Like I said, we want to ensure the privacy of our community, and we want to stay within the expectations of the community when we're doing these investigations. I think my understanding, once we had the reports and our genealogists started working on that, so we had 2 detectives, 2 genealogists. Within 11 weeks, they had identified Mr. Serreri, and they cleared the other 300 suspects that the RCMP had compiled over the last almost 50 years. Yeah, it was a great day.
Can you give a sense of, I know you have a long history with CPS, but can you give a sense of, I'm sure you don't have a number, but how many man-hours over the years have been dedicated to these cases by CPS in terms of trying to come up with that answer that you guys got that?
It's honestly, it's uncountable, because even if I was to break down their hours of work, I can tell you, like I said, the investigators that are all of major crimes, but specifically speaking to the 2 that worked on this investigation from the historical homicides, they're never not working. So I know that they put in a lot more hours than they ever claim for overtime. So it's always on their mind, and they're always trying to think of other avenues to try and solve these files.
What sort of closure does it give investigators, and also the fact that it took 5 decades to get to this point?
I think I believe, I'm very grateful to have the opportunity to work with those detectives, and there's a strong sense of satisfaction but knowing them, in their minds, they're not done yet, because they do believe there are other victims, and they'll do whatever they can to support the RCMP to see if we find any more.
If the homicides were taking place today, would justice be served to the suspects more quickly, or yeah?
I think it's a good question. I think if you look at the advances in forensic science and technology and DNA, it has created a lot of new avenues for investigative success. The investigators at that time still had the same characteristics: very driven, very tenacious, very committed, and very dedicated to seeking the truth. The advantage, we would still have to go through the investigative genetic genealogy process if we take samples from a crime scene and they're not on the national database. We do have some potential in the future where we can do some rapid testing in the future, but it definitely wouldn't be 50 years. It could be, once we decide we've exhausted all avenues, that's one of the things that one of the measures or milestones that we look at is, have we exhausted every other reasonably investigative opportunity? So, but it definitely wouldn't take 50 years.
I know the RCMP was talking about the importance of having the public come forward after their announcement today. Is there a message to Calgarians about how important it is for them to come forward to help out other historical homicides that occurred in the city?
We were actually just talking about that upstairs, and I think the police are a reflection of the community, and we can only work on what information we're provided. And I think we all have to work together as a community, share information, and that goes two ways. So when we're doing our media availabilities, to share as much as we can without damaging the integrity of the investigation, but so people understand the gravity of situations, and if they see something, say something.